Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about the Mythic Plus mentality, specifically how your mindset has to shift as you start pushing into higher keys. This is going to be a broad scope guide that applies to pretty much every class and every spec in the game, because the core ideas around cooldown management, defensives, interrupts, and target priority are pretty much universal. The lens, however, we're going to be viewing this all through is Elemental Shaman, because that's what I play and that's what I can speak to in the most detail. So you're going to be getting specific elemental callouts like cooldown examples, specific defensive examples, stuff like that. But if you're playing a different class, the underlying logic is still the same. Just swap Ascendance for whatever your cooldown is, Astral Shift for whatever your defensive is, and that philosophy all still holds true. So we're going to walk through how the philosophy shifts as keys get harder, why the send on cooldown mentality stops being the full answer in higher keys, and we're going to do that through a handful of specific bosses where this mindset shift really shows up. At low keys, you can play the specs at their truest form. Ascendance is up, press it. Stormkeeper, slam it, let's go. You don't need to think about timing windows because the damage output of your cooldowns alone tends to be enough to carry most pulls. More casts is more damage, and at sub 15 keys, the cost of holding cooldowns waiting for the perfect moments is almost always higher than the benefit you'd get from lining them up perfectly. Once you get past a 15, however, the game kind of changes in a way that's easy to miss. Mob health goes up, your damage relative to that health goes down, and suddenly there are specific moments in a dungeon where the group either does enormous burst damage together, or the group falls over. And that's the part most people don't internalize fast enough. At high keys, dungeons stop being about total damage over the dungeon, and start being about your damage during specific windows. The mindset shift in one sentence can be thought of as, low keys reward frequency, but high keys reward timing. And the really important nuance here is that holding your cooldowns for an amp window doesn't mean sitting on them for 90 seconds. If you plan correctly, you're barely holding your cooldowns at all. You send them in a rhythm that lines up naturally with those windows. Now let's start with Croth in Algathar Academy, because this is probably the cleanest example of a damage amp in the current dungeon pool. This fight has a phase where the boss gets stunned and takes massively increased damage, and that window of time is where 90% of Algathar keys either lives or fails. The entire fight is a race against your healer's mana pool and cooldowns. The more damage you do during that damage amp means the less of that fire phase your party has to endure. If you don't deal enough damage during that window, the boss lives deep into that fire phase, your healer runs out of cooldowns or mana, and then your key breaks. At a 12, this is kind of irrelevant because you do enough damage that the boss dies, regardless of the damage done during that amp window, and regardless of how you used your cooldowns. But in higher keys, hitting that window with full cooldowns is the entire difficulty of the fight. If your Ascendance and Stormkeeper aren't up for that phase, you're losing that boss before it even starts. The good news here for a 2-minute CD class like Elemental Shaman is that somewhere around a plus 17, the fight actually starts living long enough that you can send your cooldown on pull and have them fully back up for the amp window roughly 2 minutes later. So you're not really holding anything back at all, you're sending them, and then they'll eventually come back up exactly when you need them again. And that's the planning aspect I was talking about. If you understand the fight length and your cooldown timer, that hold time of your cooldowns basically becomes 0. Where this breaks down is when people press CDs halfway through a fight and the amp window comes up with their cooldowns 45 seconds away, which is the worst possible outcome because now you've effectively thrown away an entire minute of your key timer and likely bricked the key either from the timer or from wiping in the fire phase. Ultimately, every dungeon has a Croth somewhere. It might not be just a damage amp phase, but it's a moment where planning super matters. You want to find the moment in the dungeon and work backwards from there, and then figure out where to send your buttons for the greatest effect. Next up is Core Warden Nysara in Nexus Point Zenith, and this fight is a great example of how high keys force you to think about multiple things at once. Core Warden also has a bonus damage phase, so the same Croth logic applies. You want your cooldown timings to line up with that window, and if you plan correctly, that hold time is, again, minimal. The wrinkle in that damage amp phase is that it's about 15 seconds long, and the entire time your group is taking massive damage while trying to obliterate the boss. So you're not just lining up offensive cooldowns, you're now also actively managing your survival at the same time. And this is where it gets really interesting with Elemental specifically. During that 15-second window, Elemental can do absolutely bananas damage. The combination of cooldowns into a stationary boss with the damage amp is one of the highest output windows we have in the entire game. The catch is, we're also pretty dang squishy when we're doing it. Just pressing your cooldowns in the middle of a 15-second damage tornado without a defensive up is how you become a smear on the floor before that phase ends. So defensives during that window are mandatory, and they're not just about staying alive yourself, they're about taking pressure off of your healer. And this is the framing I want you to kind of think about. If you pop Astral Shift during that damage amp phase, you should be safe enough that the healer isn't overwhelmed, and you can trust that you will be safe, allowing you and the rest of the group to focus entirely on optimal damage output. And if other players hit their defensives as well, it's just better because the healer can really focus on keeping everyone alive and maybe even doing a little bit of damage. Admittedly, this matters way more for some specs than others because unfortunately, not all classes are created equal. We can't all be Demon Hunters with their absolutely ridiculous tankiness, leech, and survivability that lets them face tank everything in the game while still topping the meters. And while we're on the topic of things that aren't fair, it's time for an ad break. If you're looking for someone to teach you how to top the meters while taking 0 damage and healing yourself to full HP every 2 seconds, you're going to want to reroll a Demon Hunter. But if you're looking to do the best you can with the spec you actually have, I offer elemental coaching on my Patreon. I can't make you a Demon Hunter, but I can help you get the most out of your Elemental Shaman. But with the shameless plug out of the way, let's get back into it. Arachnid in Skyreach is one boss that catches people off guard because mechanically the fight isn't very difficult. There's no puzzle, priority, and nothing that really looks scary on paper. If you watch the fight at a plus 12, it's pretty much a free boss. The problem is the pulsing damage from those beams. At low keys, you barely notice it. At 16s and up, the pulsing damage absolutely obliterates squishy casters without a defensive up, and Elemental is right at the top of that list. And this is where we pivot away from the damage cooldown conversation for just a minute, because Arachnid isn't really a fight about offensive cooldowns, it's a survival fight. The beam's pulsing damage takes you down fast, and without a defensive, you're not surviving the full beam unless your healer is throwing everything in the kitchen sink at you, which they probably can't afford to do because there's 2 other beams. So your defensives become a planned cast tied directly to those beams. For Elemental, we got Astral Shift. For other specs, it'll be whatever the equivalent is. You know the beam is coming up, you press the button before the hit, you live, you keep casting, simple in concept, but it does require actual discipline to track across the entire fight. But here's where it gets a little bit fun and frustrating for those of us in the Shaman Club. If you happen to be one of the lucky classes that has like 6 defensives, an immunity, a bunch of leech, and a personal chef, you can pretty much solo survive this fight forever. Good for you. I'm not jealous. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit jealous. But for the rest of us, especially Elemental Shamans who have exactly 1 real defensive and an awkward Ghost Wolf or Elemental, we're going to need help eventually. Astral Shift is a 2-minute or 90-second cooldown. The beams are not. Which brings us to externals, and this is where having a group that knows what's going on definitely saves keys. Things like Cocoon from a Mistweaver, Blessing of Sacrifice from a Paladin, Ironbark from a Druid, any of these externals make those beams pretty trivial. If you're playing a class that runs out of personal defensives, you need to be communicating with the people in the group that have those buttons. We can also technically share a beam with another party member when we don't have a defensive up. Splitting the damage across 2 people is enough to bring that beam from I'm about to go down to I'm perfectly fine, and it is actually a very common play in coordinated groups on this fight. In a pug though, you can't necessarily assume any of that's going to happen. The externals might not be there on demand, and trying to share a beam with someone who doesn't know where to stand is a great way to wipe the group. So in a pug, you are pretty much planning for the worst case scenario. You assume you're surviving the beams on your own defensives, and anything your group adds on top of that is just a bonus. But ultimately, communication with your group in higher keys is imperative to making sure you time those keys. So if you're a class like Ele Shaman, make sure you're communicating that to your group. Now the last example we're going to talk about today is Ik and Crick from Pit of Saron. This boss splits into multiple images during the fight. 2 of those are fake images that channel beams which do damage to players, and those channels can be interrupted or dispelled. The real boss, meanwhile, is casting a long channeled bolt which will instantly delete whoever it lands on if it gets off. So your job in this fight is twofold. You need to delete the fake images to remove the channeled beam damage from the equation, and you need to interrupt or dispel the channels in the meantime while also making sure the boss never gets his bolt cast off. So really, I guess it's threefold. You miss a kick on the real boss, someone goes down and eats dirt. Miss a kick on the images, and the group takes a bunch of unnecessary damage that piles up very fast in higher keys. But this is also a fight where a class like Elemental Shaman can do something genuinely cool. Our interrupt is tied to a damage reduction. Kicking applies a damage reduction buff to ourselves, so every wind shear we land on this fight is doing 3 things at once. It stops a dangerous ability, it reduces incoming damage, and it keeps pressure off of the healer. Or reduces pressure. This means that in this fight specifically, you should be sending wind shear on cooldown. Every kick is a damage reduction we wouldn't otherwise have, and given Elemental only has 1 real defensive, anything we can get aside from Astral Shift is huge. The other thing on this fight is those channeled beams from the images. They apply a curse technically on whoever they're channeling on. And if you have a curse dispel, like Shaman does, you can dispel the curse to break the channel and effectively pause that cast for a moment. So in practical terms, a curse dispel in this fight works like a second kick. It's not a true interrupt, but it functions as one for the channel beams, and it's another tool that you should be using if you have it. The broader point this fight makes is about interrupts in general, and how brutally they scale with level. At low keys, missing a kick usually doesn't matter, the healer can just heal through it, but at high keys, a missed kick can wipe the group. And speaking of tracking who's kicking what and trusting your group to handle their share, this brings us to probably the single biggest variance in how any of this actually plays out in practice, which is who you're playing with. Everything I just walked you through across these 4 fights changes depending upon the group you're in, and it changes a lot. In a consistent group with comms, you can plan around all of it. The tank tells you the pull order, the healer tells you when they're popping their cooldowns, the kick rotation is already established before the dungeon even starts, and you can confidently send cooldowns when you need to because everything should already be planned. In a pug, however, all that goes out the window pretty quickly. The tank might have a weird route with weird pulls. Someone might go down and eat dirt to a mechanic you've never seen someone go down to before, and you have no information about what's going to happen in about 30 seconds from now. So in a pug, your bias should be to sending your cooldowns sooner rather than holding, because the cost of holding for a window that never materializes is way higher than the cost of using cooldowns a little suboptimally. In a group, however, you can bias towards planning. You can trust the people around you to set up the windows, trust those externals to land, and trust the kicks to happen, and then play the tighter because you have the freedom to do so. This is also why keys of the same level feel completely different depending upon the group you're playing with. A 16 with your weekly group is genuinely easier than a 14 in a bad pug, and a lot of that comes down to how confidently you can plan around things that you actually know are going to happen. So the core idea I want to leave you with is this. Cooldown management at high keys isn't really just about cooldowns. It's about understanding what's actually happening in the dungeon and making your buttons line up for moments that actually matter. Low keys reward pressing buttons when they're ready, but high keys reward pressing buttons when they matter. And if you play correctly, those two things look almost identical because your cooldowns just naturally come back in time for the windows that matter. But that's all I have for today. If this helped you out, make sure to like the video. It really does help the channel out a lot. And if you want more elemental or general WoW content like this, make sure to subscribe as well. Also, I've been streaming over on Twitch every now and again, so if you want to hang out, ask questions, or just watch while I do Raider Keys, feel free to stop by and say hi. And if you want to support the channel a bit more directly, I've linked a Patreon below where I offer coaching and additional content, along with a Discord channel where we can talk about the spec, ask questions, or just hang out with the community. But yeah, that's all I got for this one, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in the next one.